So what we're looking at today is the context of research overall. To begin to think about research takes place within a particular context, time and place. You've got to understand that and how these contextual elements influence research. This includes conceptualization, your philosophy, the theory you're using are all influences on that process. Okay? So we're going to be looking at the role of the researcher, the ways of knowing what is to be accomplished through research, what can research do, context and implementation, research evaluation, different styles of understanding research, practitioner, and the context, particularly looking at experimentation. So there's different approaches and different levels within which you as a researcher will get involved with material. And you need to be aware of what is that involvement. Your personal involvement. What are your assumptions, ideas, hypotheses? Okay? Why are you doing a piece of research? No. Why are you doing a piece of research? Make a difference. Too general. Curiosity. Understanding. Gather information. Still too general. You don't have a choice and you have to do it. Because you're interested in something and you're passionate about it. Passion, people, is an important component to doing research, because if you don't have some passion about what your subject, you won't get it finished. So you need to have some investment, personal investment into a piece of research. Otherwise it is going to be an incredibly boring, dry and dreary process. You research things that you're interested in, you want to know more, that you're curious, but that you have passion about it. It matters to you. Okay? There has to be that personal engagement. There's an interpersonal process in learning about and in working with research. You don't do research on your own. Research is not done in isolation. It's done in collaboration with other knowledge, with society, within a context that you're working. Okay? And in particular, as we're trying to emphasize, counseling and therapy research. It's not research for research's sake. This is research to help others. And that might be helping them by understanding the nature of their illness, disease, or difficulty. It might be understanding the nature of the therapeutic process, understanding the nature of the therapist's role in something. The three areas: the client, the relationship, and the therapist. Okay? And in that way, therapy is an interpersonal process. You've got to gather information from participants. You have to go and ask people to either describe something, fill in a questionnaire, take part in an experiment. So it's an interpersonal process. It's not done. You have to recruit a sample. And that's important. So you only recruit through interpersonal processes. There can be more anonymous ones like on Facebook and those kinds of elements, but there's still a personal recruitment process happening. You're going to work collaboratively in research. Okay? You're going to listen to others' ideas, even those of participants, as to devising tools and material that can be effectively referred to the problem studied. So you might make use of what's called a standardized questionnaire. Somebody has already developed a questionnaire, like Beck's depression inventory. You want to measure depression, there's a standardized questionnaire for measuring depression. But if you want to know attitudes towards watermelons, you're not going to find a standardized questionnaire on attitudes towards watermelons. Doesn't exist. You will have to make a scale. Okay? And that you then have to work and discuss and get a small focus group. What do you think about watermelons? Would you eat one? What color do you think they should be? Yeah, in order to make a meaningful questionnaire. And that's really wrong sort of questionnaires. But then, if you're going to be asking people about their experiences, which is what most of you are studying, Counseling is, if you really want to frame counseling in another way, counseling is an ongoing research into people's experiences. That's all you're doing in counseling. You're asking people about their experiences, how they make sense of it, and how they're going to move forward. That's research at the qualitative, experiential level. But within research, there are more formalized ways of doing that analysis. Once you get their story, how you make sense of that story. Okay? Now, some rather big words on the screen. Do not get scared by them. Ways of knowing what you accomplish through research. So, the acquisition of knowledge is through different frames of reference. Okay? Doesn't exist in isolation. Knowledge is held within parameters of theory and practice. And you've got to think about, is knowledge constructed or discovered? Okay? There are two ways of approaching knowledge. We either create a reality or we discover a reality. Qualitative, quantitative. When we create and co-construct a reality with our clients in therapy and or in research, we are constructing knowledge. When we hand out a questionnaire that is measuring particular elements, we are discovering knowledge. It's a more measurable, quantitative thing. Even though it still might be a constructed concept like depression, Beck's depression inventory with these questions measures depression consistently and reliably. That when it's been used, and it's been used millions of times now, it keeps giving similar scores for people who are diagnosed as depressed by professionals. Okay? So knowledge either found or co-created in research as well. Epistemological and ontological ideas need to be grasped. Okay? What do you think? Epistemology and ontological. Ontology. Epistemology is your framework and ways of thinking. Ontological ideas is the ways of discovering knowledge, the basis of our knowledge. Ontology is the basis of knowledge, and epistemology is the frame of thinking. So slow. These are important conceptual words to understand because they influence your approach to research. Please excuse the college slow computer. So, epistemology is the branch of philosophy concerned with the theory of knowledge. That's your framework in that sense. Epistemology studies the nature of knowledge, the rationality of belief, and justification. Much debate in epistemology centers on 4 areas: the philosophical analysis of the nature of knowledge, how it relates to such concepts as truth, belief, justification, various problems of skepticism, the sources and scope of knowledge and justified belief, and the criteria of knowledge and justification. Okay? How do we know what we know is what epistemology is about. How do we know what we know? Okay? That's what it's about. It's looking at the theory of that. The theory of how we know what we know. How do we know that this is white and that is whatever color green thing we came to last week? Yeah. How do we know what we know? Too complicated. Let's just try. Okay, so ontological arguments are philosophical arguments that fall into a debate about something with an a priori theory. Okay? God must exist because we have a world. Who created the world? There must have been a God who created the world. Yeah, even if you go back to the Big Bang, who started the Big Bang? Must have been a God. There must have been something out there, type idea. Okay? So there's a sense of an argument, but you cannot truly prove it or disprove it either. Okay? So this is around the construction of knowledge. One is the theory of knowledge, the other is the construction of knowledge. So, looking at what can research do. So you've got to explore, and those big terms we'll come back to explore and define in the seminars. Okay? Because it's important to grasp some of those concepts, because when you come to your methodology, there's a very important philosophical understanding that's needed to choose the right approach. And most of you will be doing qualitative research, and you have to understand that in qualitative research, it's constructed. So, what does research do? It provides a ground for evidence-based outcomes, and that's the most important business. The business of counseling. Okay, we have to make a difference. We've got to make clients' lives better. So we also need to provide the evidence for making lives better. And counseling up until now has not been very good at doing this. We all know it works. We all know it makes a difference, or we think we know it makes a difference. We believe, that's why you're all doing this, that it makes a difference. But we need to prove that to the world now. Because at this point we are losing the battle against being a profession, because we're not showing the world we make a difference. And so you need to begin thinking of yourself as a research practitioner, is one way of putting it. You're both a practitioner and a researcher at the same time. And it's really important to consider that when you do get into practice and you are seeing a lot of clients, and if you're working in a particular area rather than general practice where you're just seeing anything and everything, if you're working like I did, I was working with addictions and I was working with couples, where you can begin to do research, you've got material coming through your door every day. Build a research project into it. Ask a question. Okay? gather the information, present it at a conference, write a paper for Therapy Today. And it is there the whole time. Look for opportunities to gather data. So, for example, I had a period, I think I've told you before, of seeing a whole bunch of couples where affairs were the issue. And so I had to do investigation into that and use them as case studies to make sense of affairs from a systemic point of view. And I used that as my theory rather than psychodynamic or CBT or anything else. And that affairs form a homeostatic function for a relationship. It's good for them. Quite controversial. Okay, so research also looks at attitudes, values, cultural differences, diversity issues, by highlighting those, by investigating why black men don't go to therapy. It will highlight what are the blocks and barriers and create social justice. Attitudes. That's why we've managed to develop and explore and come up with concepts like institutional racism. I hadn't heard of the term before. How can an institution be racist? It's a building, you know. But there are practices within an institution, and it's those kinds of things that can highlight important elements and help improve people's lot in society. Okay, and that's where the important pragmatic element through that inquiry comes about. You can bring about change. This is why, as counsellors, we need to do research. Does a particular method work or not work? Which works better? What works for whom? Does hitting your client with a 2x4 improve their therapy attendance? No, probably not. So it's about what are the practical things that would improve therapy attendance. I mean, it's one of the controversial things. People don't come to therapy. Why? They want help, but they don't come. You know, what is stopping them coming to therapy? You might be able to discover an answer. That therapy is scheduled at different times. Homework might help keep them engaged in therapy. A phone call during the week. A letter to them, reflecting on the last session that they get midweek before the next session. Would that improve attendance? You know, these are just ideas. I don't know whether they would or wouldn't. You know, things you can experiment with. Okay. As part of almost moving to the next element, the inquiry testing by shaping knowledge as to the current needs of society. I mean, what people needed 10 years ago is very different from what people are needing now. So what are the new elements we're going to face with? If you had to look ahead in the next 10 to 15 years, what do you think is going to be the biggest need in society from a psychosocial counseling point of view? What are we going to be faced with? Any ideas? What do you think is one of the biggest issues we're facing? Overpopulation. How's that going to be a counseling issue? Too many people results in overcrowding. Back to Victorian slums. No schools, no jobs, social unemployment, social unrest, poverty, housing, poor housing. Yeah. Just one. Overpopulation. Baby boomers. Who are the baby boomers? Baby boomers refers to a particular cohort of babies born post-World War II who are now all in retirement. There was a growth after World War II. During the war, there was a drop-off because people didn't want to have kids. They don't want to bring kids up into a war. I mean, the men were away. Not that it stopped many. But so when they came back, you had this massive baby boom. And so you've got a skew in the normal population distribution. We've suddenly got this big bulk from the 50s to the late 60s of an increase in birth rate. They're now all reaching retirement age, or have. I mean, think about it. The Rolling Stones are all retired. They've got bus passes. I mean, really. Yeah. But what are we faced with there going forward? This is a big group of people who are well educated, well financed, healthier than ever before, but elderly. So what is being elderly going to mean? When I was a kid, being elderly meant 65 and you died. Okay, now it's a completely different kettle of fish. That's about looking ahead. What are the trends? What are we going to look at? So one of the big trends is going to be elderly care. Dementia, physical disabilities, care homes, community models for looking after. There aren't enough old age homes to put them in. We've got to find new models, like the Danish one, where they have students living in old age homes and they're all allocated somebody they share their space with, and they are responsible for their care. And they get free accommodation and meals to attend university whilst doing this. Brilliant. Yeah. So that's all part of moving forward. So you've got to be thinking about ahead. What's going to be interesting to you? How's it going to develop? Yeah, sorry. So, various things you need to think around context and the implementation of research. What is the area you're covering? How are you going to explore the data? How big an area are you going to investigate? How narrow an area are you going to investigate? Okay. Particularly when it comes to your dissertation, people, do not conceive of doctoral theses, please. You all have great, grand ideas. Keep them for your doctorate. Narrow that down into one single small thing that you may want to do. Okay? This is a training run for your undergraduate dissertation. So don't get too big on your ideas. Okay? So your implementation has to follow the systematic research process, i.e. the research cycle. We spoke about last week. Think about your interventions and evaluations and what is your conceptual or contextual framework that you'll be using. So you want to investigate depression. How are you going to conceive what depression is, first of all? How you conceptualize depression? Is it feeling sad? Or is it those who have the clinical symptoms of depression? Lack of sleep, tired, anxious, waking up at 3 in the morning, can't go back to sleep. That's clinical depression. But people who are just sad might not have those symptoms. Are they included in your study? Aren't they? Are you working from a medical definition, or are you working from a psychodynamic definition or a CBT definition? So all your conceptualization and contextualizing creates a frame around which you do your research. And the important thing about the frame is it defines it clearly, but it also holds you in place. So you don't go wandering off down the side roads and get lost, which is what can very easily happen in research. Oh, that's interesting. And off you go following the white rabbit. We all know where the white rabbit went, don't we? You don't want to be Alice in Wonderland. You want to stay on track to get your project finished. So you've got to think about how you're framing your work. And so part of that is sticking to the research process that we spoke about last week. Okay, so this is just a more detailed version of the same process. Thinking the research idea, reviewing the literature, the theoretical formulation of the research problem, operationalizing your research question into empirical research question. So you've got your broad research question, but it needs to be operationalized for the research to happen. your research design, and that's your methodology, planning and implementation. You collect your data, that's your method. Your data analysis, once you've got it, how do you analyze your data? There's different theories, ideas, and approaches to data analysis. Is it quantitative, qualitative? Each one will give you a different slice of the cake. So you've got this cake of data. Are you cutting it this way, or are you cutting it that way? Which level of the cake are you cutting through? All of these need to be taken into account. Because each time you cut the cake differently, you'll get a different answer out of your data. Then you need to answer your research question. Has the data you collected answered your question, and how does that make sense theoretically? What does this mean for theory? What does this mean for practice? You compare it to earlier research, so that's your literature review. So in the literature it said X and I found Y, or the literature said X, I also found X. It confirms what's been done before. And you come to your conclusions. The research process. You keep that in mind at all times. You will not go wrong. So, in the research context, overall, you're human and you have biases. We all want to prove what we believe. That's the main bias in any research. I believe white skinheads are all racist. Okay? And you will prove that white skinheads are all racist. But maybe they aren't. Majority might be. Not all. Okay? So you have a bias. Your formal research process makes constructed results so that that bias is held in check. That element does not cloud your study. You have to frame your context and adapt to the data as it's generated. Okay? So as you gather information, that will inform you whether you're on the right track or not. And that's why frequently people do pilot studies. So rather than going, right, I'm going to get all my data, how do you know that your question is actually giving you the data you need? Okay, best I use this on a smaller group, see what kind of answers I'm getting back. Are these answers going to answer my question? That's all that research is about. You're trying to find an answer to a question. You've posed a question, are all white skinheads racist? You're gathering data to answer that question. Has the data you gathered, the information you gathered, answered the question? So often you need to do a pilot or a test run. Often it's done amongst classmates, if they're the appropriate group. And then you would adapt, saying, oh, hell, well, all my questions are actually biased. They're going to say, all these questions you're asking are saying, you're assuming they're racist. Again, saying, are you racist? And again, it's the process of evidence, context, and facilitation throughout evaluating that on your process. There's two ways in which information is gathered. Top down or bottom up. So you're either going from specific to general, or you're gathering from general to specific. So when you're going from top down, you've got a specific idea and you're testing it out. You've read this book and that theory, and you've got, I think drug users use drugs because drugs are a good mothering object. Okay? That was my hypothesis. Drug users keep using because drugs are a consistent mothering object. That was my hypothesis from my reading. Okay? That when you use a drug, it will always give you the same and consistent response that humans can't. And that was a top-down. So I then took that idea and went to addicts and said, tell me about a cycle of drug use. How you began, how it evolved, what set you off, what stopped you, how did you come down. And that's a top-down. A bottom-up is, like I had the one on affairs, I was encountering a lot of information that I couldn't make sense of. How do you understand the nature of affairs? What role does it play in the marriage? I had 10 couples where affairs were playing out. Plus I had a few who were lovers, chronic lovers, when we're putting them, they weren't getting married but were constantly involved with married partners. How do I make sense of all of this? So I was going from the bottom up. Okay? So you think about that. You categorize, your perceptions help you categorize. These are all part of your biases, all part of your reading. So if I had taken a psychodynamic model of the couples, I would have had a very different conceptualization than the one I took, which was systemic. Those determine how you're reading the information. Okay? How you formulate identifies what you end up focusing on. Again, your question needs to be sharp and clear and distinctive, because otherwise, if you've got a bit of a blunt instrument, you're going to be focusing on a larger area rather than a single area. And so don't take it when down the line you're going to be getting feedback from your supervisors or the lecturer saying that's still not clear enough. What are you actually researching when you're saying depression or affairs? What kind of affairs? What are you talking about? You know, when is an affair an affair? Is that an affair? Okay, how long should it have been going on for? Is a one night stand an affair? Okay. No, it's a one night stand. Is a relationship with another person what they call an affair of the heart, but they haven't had sex? Is that an affair? Okay. So these are the formulations of your context of how you're defining its operational elements. Okay? Sharpeners and levelers. Those who notice contrasts and maintain stimulus differentiation when doing research, sharpeners. And those who notice similarities but ignore differences. Okay? You're drawing distinctions. That's what sharpeners and levelers are about. Are you looking at what is there in common, leveler, but we ignore any of the smaller bits that don't count, or those who are drawing out the contrasts? You're looking at those pointy bits. Now, are we looking at the roses, or are we looking at the thorns? Type idea. To make sense of the data. So, levelers are people who often look at broad-based research. They're looking at volumes of data. The London Underground, there were 10 million passengers on the Underground last year. They're looking at broad, not the small bits. Most of them are between, but why is there a night tube now? You know, because there was a review of things. So, one of the big things that people do is experimentation. Do not consider an experiment for your dissertation, please. A, it takes too long, invariably, particularly around counseling. If you think, I'm going to see if CBT makes a difference on anxiety for exams. How long are you going to need? Exactly, you've got to have a start, you've got to have people go through a process of therapy and come out and attest before and after results. You normally don't have that time scale. Okay, so be careful around experiments. But experiments are the backbone, or seen as the golden sample of any research, because you have eliminated different elements and you're focusing on one thing. Do instructions to shock the participant? Are they followed by the person under investigation? You know, the Milgram experiments, where if a man in a white coat tells you to shock somebody, you will shock them. Because he's a man in authority and I don't have to take responsibility. He told me he got it wrong, I've got to shock him. Okay? And it's about observation. But how do you go about observation? Are you describing the object? Are you exploring it? Are you looking at the situation? Are you looking at the subjective phenomenon? There's different levels of analysis again. What are you looking at? Are you the experimenter outside the box, observing? So, how do people use the new pedestrian crossings on Oxford Street? You know, where you can cross wherever. There you might be sitting in an office block looking at the patterns of how people go across. Okay? Are you exploring a situation specific, or are you exploring a subjective experience, unique subjective phenomenon, an experience of elements? So again, that is what most of us deal with in therapy and in work. So it's again, how are you observing it? Through which window or pair of glasses are you wearing when you're observing your objects? Okay? The frame determines what you see. If the window is looking out on that and seeing that, but if you look out another window, you're going to see a different view. You stand higher up in the window, you're going to get another view. To use a sort of practical example. What is the view you're taking? Is all part of the context of your research. So research isn't this magical thing that just happens. It's a very nuanced and defined element. And again, how you think about it determines on what you see. You know, you've all seen the figure ground object of the two faces or the glass. How you see what you're looking for will determine what you see as well. So most research is self-fulfilling prophecies in some way. But as a practitioner researcher, this is where you can make use of a lot of case studies. Okay? Assessment, you formulate them, you can form case study reports, present these to team members or colleagues at support groups, peer supervision groups, discuss them even with clients. Case studies are what you're doing all the time in therapy. It's a natural way to do research. That's how Freud came upon his stuff. He used case studies. He didn't use large samples. He was case study based on his research. So, read section 1.2 in Saunders and Wilkes to look at some of these elements. It's got an area on variables and stuff that we'll discuss in next week's lecture, but I want you to get some of your heads around that as well. Looks like half the work is done. All you need to do is fill in the top part so we can legally say the bottom part. Eating chocolate will make you look younger and thinner. So, be careful that you do not start with a conclusion and then make what you do prove it. Any questions? How is this getting across to